Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good or good evening, wherever you might be joining from. I see names from all over the world here, some of them familiar. So, this is a very exciting time for all of us at the Global Sustainability Challenge. We are in the third and the final phase of the inaugural challenge, the first ever that has existed, and we've chosen top 40 teams from all over the world that are going to converge in Munich to showcase their projects. I see many of those teammates and students here, but even more importantly, I see students from phase two and even phase one here, which is to me the most inspiring part. And almost like a broken record, I keep saying that for GSC, the prize is not to be a winner at the global finale. It really is to engage with sustainability, to understand the problems and experiment with solutions and really get to know what you can do to help this planetary challenge. So, thank you everyone for being here. I'm very, very excited for our conversation today with my colleague and dear friend, Keegan Cook. He's the director of Stanford Ecopreneurship, which is a joint initiative between the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability and Stanford's Graduate School of Business. And Keegan is an amazing entrepreneur who has worked on a range of product and business problems, everything including renewable energy supply at the bottom of the ocean, water quality in urban Bangladesh, economic mobility in Kenya, and water supply in rural Tanzania. So you can see that he has a very wide range of experiences. And not only has he been a serial entrepreneur of two startups that were acquired, but he's also been an advisor to many, many startups. So you can see that he has a wide range of experiences. And today we'll talk about what are the different pathways through which you can take your innovation into the real world. And startups are one pathway, but not necessarily the only answer. And with that, Keegan, I'll hand over to you. Thank you so much for doing it.
Oh, thank you, Parul, and so happy to be with you all. I'm so excited about the Global Sustainability Challenge and so excited about the impact that you're going to make throughout the challenge and throughout your lives. And so happy to be here with you. And I think to guide this conversation, I prepared a few slides. And so I'll go ahead and get my slides going here. So as Parul mentioned, we're talking about different pathways here today. And my intention for these slides and for this conversation is to widen your aperture a little bit to recognize that there are many pathways to find impact and success. And I hope to just introduce a few different pathways to you in case they haven't been part of your purview so far. And I've made many assumptions about you as an audience. I've made the assumption that you've already been interacting with potential users and doing customer discovery work. I've made the assumption that through that work, you've gotten some positive signals that have given you some conviction to keep working on this project. I'm making the assumption that you're affiliated with the university and that some of you may have some IP that the university will want to own. Some of you may not, but some of you may. And that you want to continue working on this after GSC and that you're curious about the different pathways to find impact. And so I'm going to talk about 5 different pathways that we often see our academic innovators leverage here at Stanford. I'm taking a very US-centric approach just because that's what I'm familiar with, but these pathways have equivalents in many countries around the world. And so I think even if I use some specific language that is very US-centric, hopefully the principles still apply globally. And these pathways we're going to talk about, the first is what we're calling an institutional initiative. And so what I'm really describing in this case is if you're already, let's say, an undergrad or a graduate student in a university, you have some faculty mentorship, sometimes the pathway to impact is to create an initiative within that university or within that institution that you're part of. So we'll talk about that. Another pathway is to license to a third party. So having another company be able to use your innovation. Another pathway is to create a nonprofit, and another one is to create a for-profit company. And then the fifth one may be the most ambiguous. We're calling it a hybrid approach. In the US and some other countries such as Germany, there's starting to become new types of for-profit companies that have a mission baked into the company agreement. And so it's this hybrid between a for-profit and a nonprofit type of entity. So we'll talk a little bit about that too. All right. So in choosing a pathway or selecting a couple pathways to pursue first, there are a lot of factors that we hope you will consider. Some are external factors that you've gathered through your customer discovery work, and some, if not more important or equally important, are internal factors, things that are inherent to you that will hopefully guide your pathway. And so let's talk about external factors first. One is, throughout your customer discovery work, have you found that the people that you are trying to serve, the people who are experiencing the pain point or have the need that you're trying to address, are they able to pay enough for the solution to that pain point to create a profitable business? And sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes the answer is no. There's still pathways to create impact and solve that pain point, regardless of what you find. But we often recommend that if they are able to pay enough for that solution to be profitable and create a profitable business, the economic drivers of that for-profit entity will help your speed and scale. And so we often anchor our mentality towards that if that's possible. How much capital do you think you need to get started? Some projects need a lot of capital up front, some don't. Some projects need a lot of capital throughout their lifetime to reach impact, and some don't. So that's an external factor to consider. What kind of talent or expertise will you need for this project to be successful? Different pathways cater to different types of talent. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And are there real constraints that you have to pay attention to, such as the university IP constraints or other constraints that you might be subject to? Okay, so let's switch over to internal factors. How do you and your team prioritize impact versus profit if the two are in conflict? Sometimes they are not in conflict. Sometimes they are. And so you and your team need to find your own compass on how you will navigate those situations if they arise. How important is speed to deployment? Some of the pathways we'll talk about let you get going really quickly, and others take a while to ramp up. And so that's a factor that is important for your team to consider. How much time do you actually want to spend on this? Are you going to spend the next 10 years of your life, days and nights, working hard on this? Or do you have other things you need to do and you need to limit your time on this project? How much control do you want to maintain over this project? Some pathways, as we'll talk about, mean that you have to give up a lot of control in order to be successful. All right, so these are the factors that I hope you consider and talk about with your teammates. Now, what we're going to do, don't worry, you don't have to memorize the slide. This is a summary slide of all the things we're about to talk about. And so you'll get to see the slide and digest the slide over time as we send it out to the group. But my message here is that some pathways are catered to some of these decision factors more than others. So we'll walk through that pretty quickly. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about institutional initiatives. So kind of what I described earlier, what we're talking about is an initiative that's housed within your university or another institution that you're a part of. And typically an initiative is created because of a mission that you want to accomplish. Typically fundraising comes through grants or funding from the institution itself. Typically it's a long horizon for that funding. Sometimes you can actually create revenue with these initiatives. Sometimes you can't, either through constraints of your institution or constraints of your users. And the compensation or the reward for you for going down this pathway is stability. You get to remain part of that institution. The quality of life may be suitable, more relaxed than, let's say, a for-profit venture. I put a question mark in there because sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes working within an initiative is just as rigorous and hard as a for-profit venture. So it's something to, pay attention to. And alignment with the mission. And so the pros for leveraging this pathway, typically the biggest factor is, do you need to leverage your institution's brand and network to be successful? Sometimes you'll find that that's actually a really strong requirement of your success. And so that leads ecopreneurs down this pathway typically. The cons, compensation might not be as high as a for-profit venture, let's say. You typically don't have full control within an institutional initiative because you are tied to the institution's brand. And institutions can move pretty slowly. The customer discovery signals that might lead you to think about this pathway are that brand recognition and that trust that you need to build. That might be a big signal. But also, if this is a venture where your users aren't able to pay you for your solution enough to create a new venture, keeping it within an institution may help get you launched still. Okay. All right, I'm going to move on, and then I'll just cruise through these pretty quickly, but we're hoping that there's going to be plenty of time for discussion at the end so that we can bounce ideas back and forth with you all. All right, so the next one is licensing to a third party. So this, along with the institutional initiative, this is another pathway where you're not creating a new organization. You have some kind of innovation, some technology, you have ownership of that IP, the intellectual property, and you're allowing a third-party organization to use that and typically pay some kind of compensation, typically a royalty for use of that technology. Usually there's a mission tied to this too, but the biggest factor is that you're allowing a third party who's typically much larger to leverage your technology quickly. And so you're able to leverage their infrastructure to get up to speed and scale very quickly. You don't do any fundraising for this because you're not creating any new organization. And the revenue that you receive or the compensation you receive is really case specific. If you're within a university, for example, and the university owns that intellectual property, typically the university gets a fair share of the compensation or the royalty. And then some universities give some of that profit share with the actual inventor. So what we see typical in US universities is the original inventor gets about a third of that profit that you get from the license. Okay. Pros, you don't need to fundraise, you don't need to build a team, you don't need to operate anything, and you can get up to speed and scale very quickly. The cons, you lose all control. So once this party leverages your IP, it is there to use as they wish. And sometimes you may find a situation where there's a high risk that they will use your innovation in a way that you didn't intend, but you don't have any control over that. There's also a risk of what we call shelving. There's cases where a company will purchase a license, and let's say it's an exclusive license so that they make sure nobody else in the world can use that technology. And then either consciously or unconsciously, that technology will be shelved. It will not be used. It'll just sit somewhere in their file system and never go anywhere. Sometimes it's conscious. They don't want their competitors to use this technology, so they acquire the rights and then they shelve it. And then sometimes it's unconscious. The leadership of that organization changes, the priorities change, and this just goes by the wayside. So that's a real risk to consider as well. The customer discovery signals that would lead you towards this is that your users seem to have a deep loyalty to some existing vendors that could become your licensor, and that you get the signal that in order to satisfy your user's pain point, you're going to have to build a lot of infrastructure, and it's going to take a lot of time and money, and you might choose that that's not a pathway you want to pursue. Market research signals could be high barriers to entry, such as regulatory approvals. And there are industries where licensing is the norm, like in biotech and material sciences. So you'll see a lot more licensing type arrangements in those types of industries. All right. All right, I'm going to move on to nonprofits. So nonprofits, at least in the US, the way this is structured is that you can still create a profitable organization. It's a misnomer to call it a nonprofit because nonprofits actually can be very profitable. You can sell things, you can get profit. The thing that differentiates it is that you don't have shareholders that you need to be fiducially responsible for. You don't need to maximize profit for your shareholders. And so that's what characterizes a nonprofit in the US. And I believe it's similar in other countries too. So the thing about nonprofits is you typically have a stated mission. Usually fundraising comes in the forms of donations, grants, government grants, and also other corporate grants. There's tax benefits to folks that are able to provide donations to a nonprofit. And so by choosing a nonprofit status, you allow yourself and you open yourself up for a lot of granting opportunities that wouldn't be available to you if you were a for-profit, for example. Like I said earlier, you can still get revenue. You can still have sales and services. You can charge fees, all that stuff. And you can still compensate people fairly and equitably and sometimes lucratively. You just don't have to adhere to the shareholders' financial interests because you don't have shareholders. All right, so the compensation, there may be, in some not-for-profit examples, a higher quality of life, a more balanced life. However, I still put that little question mark in there because sometimes that's not true. Sometimes working in a nonprofit is just as intense as working in a for-profit. All right, pros. Strong mission alignment. The nonprofit is built to, achieve a mission. Sometimes nonprofits allow you to recruit talent that expects lower compensation, and therefore you can create organizations with a lower cost structure because the folks are joining your organization for the mission. Better lifestyle, question mark, maybe. And then cons, there's no windfall economics. You don't sell a nonprofit and make a boatload of money all of a sudden. You don't have access to a lot of large pools of capital that are geared profit entities. And in some cases, acquiring talent can be difficult if you do not have the ability to compensate them at the rate that for-profits can. So it's a consideration to think about. And then in terms of customer discovery signals that would lead you to this path, I think the biggest one is that your beneficiaries express strong need. They really like your solution, but they are not able to pay for the solution in order to make it profitable. Another signal is if you find that your solution has a high impact per dollar ratio, and impact can be defined in many different ways, but if you're finding that you're able to, change lives in a really meaningful way with a relatively low amount of money, that is a really strong signal that would make you appealing for donations from foundations and other philanthropic capital. So it's something to pay attention to as well. All right, we're going to go to the for-profit venture. All right, the mandate of a for-profit venture, as specified in the founding agreements, is to maximize shareholder profits, and so that is your mission as a for-profit venture. The fundraising can, involve a wide variety of different capital sources. Here in Silicon Valley, we see a lot of mix between bootstrapping. That means, using pretty low amounts of funding to get going and start generating some revenue that continues the growth. We see a lot of angel investment, folks that want to invest in really early stage for-profits. And then for-profit ventures that have a really large market opportunity, venture capitalists is something that is very common in the Silicon Valley too. Okay. And then any company that you can think of, you get revenue from selling goods and services. And the compensation that usually comes in working for a for-profit is a mix of cash, of a salary, but also equity in the company so that you can enjoy some windfall economics in the future if the company does very well. So the pros, the economic of this for-profit model inherently drives speed and scale and unlocks a lot of large capital sources. And then the cons is that it can be difficult to maintain orientation with your mission, especially because it is not part of your charter as an organization. And typically for-profit companies, given this economic engine, this drive towards speed and scale, typically it's a very intense lifestyle, both time and energy. So customer discovery signals, customers have the ability and willingness to pay enough for the solution in order to enable a for-profit venture or profitable venture. And then a market signal from your market research could be that you find clear differentiation and a competitive advantage so that you can outcompete other for-profit companies. All right, now I'm just going to touch very lightly on this hybrid model just because I know it's a burgeoning field and we're starting to see these structures in the US and Germany and other places in Europe, but I know that it's not as common in other countries too yet. So what this is, it's a for-profit company, but in the legal charter of the company, you have a balance between maximizing shareholder profits and the mission that you want to achieve. And so you can make decisions based on those two different mandates of your organization. You can still enjoy the fundraising capability of a for-profit because you are creating a profitable business. You can tap into venture capital if your opportunity is large enough. And you can also take advantage of certain grant opportunities that are allocated not just for nonprofits, but for these type of hybrid arrangements. You still can get revenue from selling goods and services, and you can still compensate your employees with a mix of salary and equity in the company. And so the pros is kind of similar to the for-profit pros. The economic upside drives the speed and scale, but you also have a legal justification for pursuing mission-oriented activities. And we'll talk about an example of that in a second. The con is that it is, for some investors, a mixed signal. They don't want to be put in a position as an investor where they're investing in a company that has to make a trade-off between mission-aligned activity or for-profit activity, or profitable activity. Some investors don't care. Some investors actually see this as a huge benefit. They only want to invest in these types of hybrid organizations, but there are some investors that won't do it. And then you may find yourself in tricky situations where you have a decision on a particular market to go after, and one is more profitable, one is more aligned with your mission. With this legal charter, you could do either, and so you open yourself to a little bit of that complexity. Okay. And then, as I mentioned, the market signals are very similar to that of the for-profit. Okay. I think I will stop here and open it up for discussion. What questions might you have? What dilemmas might you be facing at the moment that we can walk through?
Yeah, thank you so much, Keegan. There's obviously a lot to unpack in each of those pathways, and we have a question in the chat. I'll read that out because, especially on the recording, people can't see the chat. The question is from Aldiana. I hope I'm pronouncing that
Yes, I
correct.
mean,
Or
I
if
can
you
also
would
read it out.
please, yeah, please do.
Hello, thank you both so much for having this workshop for us. It's very good for us, especially coming from engineering background where we don't really deal with things like this. So it's I'm very grateful, but I have questions related to the nonprofit slides that you have showed us, Keegan. The first question is, I'll read it out. When a company is non-profitable, it's hard to compete with companies who do have a big profit and big industry salaries. But my question is, how can we attract and keep talented people when we cannot really offer them what they can get somewhere else? Is it more like a mission to drive? Is it just something deeper to keep them in a company? The goals we want to achieve, maybe from your experience, what
Yeah.
would you say?
Thanks so much for asking. It's a dilemma that our ecopreneurs face all the time. And I think as a nonprofit, the selling points that you give to a potential employee is mission alignment. Their
Mm-hmm.
lives will be leveraged to make a big impact in the world. A for-profit company, may not be able to offer that to them. A team that has shared values. And some really talented people will recognize that they want that path over working for some for-profit where, you know, their brains, their lives may be used for just making other people richer, and they may not be super attracted by that. And so you'll have to interact with a lot of different candidates, and some will have their own priorities. But as a nonprofit, I think that's what you anchor on is just that mission alignment and the potential impact they can make.
Yeah, exactly, because I'm also at my master's and we focus on sustainability because Europe is going towards decarbonization and it's very important. But a lot of times we might meet people and hear people who do not really think about that part, but rather the money.
Yeah.
And we can all agree that money is important because we cannot live without it, but there should be some goals given to a person and some values that we should follow, especially as engineers, depending on where you work and what you do. But now I got off the topic. Thank you for your answer.
No, I'll just comment by saying finding teammates is hard in general. And it's a dating process where you will meet lots of people. You may want to have activities to do with them first before you hire them to make sure that it's a good fit. And so you'll get some folks that are not aligned, and then hopefully you'll find some folks that are.
Yeah. Do these companies, when they have interviews with candidates, for example, how could how can I say, how could they know that the candidate is something that fits them when it comes to these
Yeah.
values and morals, for example? Are there any strategies when an interviewer could analyze a person?
Yeah, everybody has their own interview technique. What I like to do is I like to make sure that the basics are communicated in the job description up front. So
Mhm.
at least people who have read the job description kind of understand what the role is, what the compensation is, all that stuff before you waste time talking with them. And then it's a series of conversations where you may have some questions in the beginning. There's a resource that we can email out after this for finding co-founders. It's 50 questions to ask a potential co-founder. And it's a series of conversations, trying to find a relaxed environment to really get to know the person. So people approach it in different ways.
So the other question was, in your experience, at what point does the lack of financial stability start to compromise the technical quality of the project because it becomes unaffordable to have the required expertise?
Yeah, Such a deep question. I think in general, your goal as an ecopreneur is to be open and honest with the teammates that you have, the investors that you have, about your financial situation and other things, so that nobody is surprised when you communicate that you only have a week's left of funding or a month left of funding. And you'll want to find teammates that want to go on that journey with you. It's a wild ride, and people who join you on this should know that it's a wild ride, that they are taking a risk working on something new that's never been done before versus working at a large established company. They should know that up front. And then if you need particular expertise but aren't able to compensate them in salary or other things, you'll have to get creative on other ways to compensate them. Either through, if you're doing a for-profit, that means offering them equity. If you're doing other types of ventures, you may have to offer them something else. We're going to feature you on our website as our advisor, and this is going to help you in your own work or whatever it is. Other ways of getting their time if you're low on cash.
Okay, I understand. Thank you so much for answering my questions.
Oh, best of luck. Thanks for the questions. Looks like Don has a question.
Hope all of you are good. I'm Don Juma from Kenya. I have a concern first. I just wanna ask you to enlighten us on the core objective of the session we are discussing. And the second thing, I just want to ask, when you are talking about a social enterprise, where does it fall? Because I've seen we have licensing to third party, we have non-profit, hybrid. So a social enterprise, where does it fall? Thank you.
Oh, that's great. I'll answer the second question first. So the term social enterprise is a term we used pretty broadly for an organization that has some social impact mission towards it. And sometimes social enterprises can be for profit, and sometimes they can be nonprofit, sometimes they can be hybrid, sometimes they can be an institutional initiative, and we will still call them a social enterprise. I would say if pursuing a social enterprise resonates with you, please do pursue it. And then the legal structure to support it, that can fall out with the specifics of your project that you discover through your customer discovery process or your internal team negotiations. The legal structure can be determined a little later, and you can still maintain this aspect of being a social enterprise. Did that answer your question, or did I misunderstand?
Okay. I think I've heard it. The first question, I can repeat the first question.
Great.
The first question was, can you just enlighten us on the objective of the session so that as we cruise across it, we know the thing we expect by the end of it. Thank you.
Yeah, the goal of this session is just to widen your aperture on different pathways that might be most well suited to your project. And because what we realize is that some of our ecopreneurs, they early on in their journey, they will say, "Oh, I want to start a nonprofit," or "I'm going to start a for-profit," and they don't have that decision. They don't have that decision be informed by their customer discovery work or their internal values that they discuss with their team. And so we wanted to make sure that these pathways were available, that were in your radar so that you can choose what is best suited for your project.
We also had Abdullah raise his hand sometime. Abdullah, do you still have a question?
I belong to Eco Africa innovation team, and we have great combination of tech and finance and business background, as well as our team lead is have a agriculture background. So the thing is that we belong to different regions, and particularly I belong to Pakistan, and they belong to Lesotho and Ghana, and another our teammates are from Bangladesh. So the thing is that our time does not match when we try to collaborate. It's totally remote. We are working on this project remotely. So how can we continue effectively after the getting grant or maybe funding from this challenge?
Yeah. It sounds like a real tough challenge to navigate different team members in different time zones. And I recognize entrepreneurship and these projects, they're hard already, even if you had everybody in the same location. And so adding on the challenge of different time zones sounds like a real challenge. My advice is you'll have to have an honest conversation on what is possible with this distributed team and what is not. And you may come to the conclusion that we have to found something in this region and we're going to seek grant money for this in this region, and that others will be collaborators, but they'll have to operate in their own region, for example. Or you might find that there's one particular time zone that everyone can join every week and you make it work. But I can sense the strain in your voice on how this situation can be challenging. And so my advice is just have an honest conversation with your team and choose a path forward. And sometimes that means splitting into different groups. And that's okay. That's part of the process.
Thank you, Keegan. Thank you for thank you so much for your kind suggestion, and I really welcome this.
Great, great. Best of luck. Wishing you the best.
Thank you. I see a couple of hands raised, but I'm trying to sequence everything in the order they came in. And we have a question from Mohammed in the chat. Mohammed, would you like to speak to it?
So first of all, thank you so much, Sir Keegan. You have a very wonderful presentation and I really loved it. And my question is that when we are creating a startup, in the start there is a different situation, and when we move on, we have something developed like at the middle or at the larger scale. So in the start, we have some people, some core members like the co-founders or founders, and we have a sort of equity in the share of that startup. And when we move on, we have a large venture, we have a lot of employees. Definitely, we cannot give them equity. We rather give them the salaries. So how we can differentiate between these when we have to give equity and when we have to give salary?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll share some norms that we see here in California. The norms in your area may be a little bit different. So I would pay attention to what norms you're seeing in your region. So what we see here in California, we typically, it's funny, we typically see teams where there's a founding team, where everybody is considered a founder. The funny thing is, and it's not a legal designation. There's no legal definition of what a founder is. It's more of a messaging of, I was part of the core team. And typically those founders are heavily compensated in equity. And then if those who are not part of the founding team, but rather the first employees or the first hires, typically the equity that they get is much, much less, but they still get some. I'll just give a random example just to kind of set the stage here. So let's say you start off with a founding team of 2 people, and they decide that they want to split the equity 50-50. They haven't raised any money at all yet, so nobody else is involved yet. But so far, it's just 50%, 50%, these two founders owning this company. Then investors start getting involved, and their equity starts getting what we call diluted. So the size of the company grows in its value, but the percentage that those original founders gets less and less. And typically when that stage happens, a pool of capital, a pool of equity is reserved for future hires. And so future hires may get 1% or maybe even up to 3%, but it isn't close to the 50 or 30% that the founders get. And so it's typically there's a pretty stark contrast. And so as you're going out and seeking to build your team, it's often helpful to have that delineation of, okay, this was the founding team versus these are the employees that we hire. And then typically there's compensation norms that you might find in your region on how much equity is offered to these types of employees, how much salary is offered, so that you can create a competitive offer to acquire that talent. And so curious your response to that, and also curious, Parul, if you have any advice from your founding experience.
I think you covered it pretty comprehensively, Keegan. Yeah, just varies a little bit by region. And maybe the only other thing that I can add is that there's a lot of art in deciding compensation, the combination of salary and equity. It's not a science, and often you can trade off one for the other. At least that's what we had to do when we had talent that was really important. If we didn't have money to give, in the earlier stages, we'd give them more equity. And later on, as the company was better funded or had more cash on hand, we'd try to preserve equity and give more cash. And individual preferences vary. You can see what the candidate is interested in and always come up with a win-win combination.
All right. Can I ask second question related to that?
Sure.
Okay, thank you. My second question is that, sir, I love your example. Two founders are in one startup, they have 50% equity. So I want to know from your experience that is it good to go with the equal equity distributed among members, or it's like dependent on the task which you are giving?
It's such a great question. I can share some perspectives, but at the end of the day, equity distribution is a very emotional thing. And so what typically happens is when folks are negotiating equity, they will bring forth objective information to help their case. So based on the norms of this industry, I want this amount of equity, or based on the norms of my talent, I want this amount of equity. They try to bring that as objective information, and the company will do the same. They'll say, oh, actually, we need to retain this equity for our future hires. And so this is how the negotiation typically works. At the end of the day, it's a very emotional decision. Do you feel, and do your employees and your teammates feel good about the equity that you have been allocated? Do you feel motivated to keep going based on that compensation package? And so I just wanted to acknowledge that people will try to make the conversation very objective, but at the end of the day, you have to feel good. You want you and your employees and your co-founders to feel good. So to your question about 50-50. So we have some faculty that will say, hey, don't even bother in the early days where you're negotiating equity between your teammates. Don't even bother trying to go through that phase of allocating points. I had the idea, and I have this skill set, and I'm at the end of that conversation, you end up with 30. if you have three teammates, you have 30, 30, 40. Some of our faculty say don't even bother doing that because at the earliest stages, everybody is going to work really hard. Everybody's going to have to adapt and build new skill sets as this organization grows. And so that kind of fairness element will propel you in the beginning. Other faculty will recommend, no, actually put a spreadsheet together, allocate value on different things. Like I bring this network and I bring this skill set and all that stuff. And so you have to do what feels right for you and your team. But at the end of the day, the goal is for everyone to feel good and motivated to keep going.
Wonderful. I think we should shift into rapid fire mode. We have only about
Great.
10 minutes and at least 4 people waiting with questions in the chat and so on. Yara, do you want to go next with your question in the chat?
Yes, absolutely. So I want to wrap my question and keep it as brief as possible. But something we've observed working on our project so far is that we can only deliver impact when we operate at scale, or that's something that we really want to do to reach as many people as we found suffer from the problem that we're trying to solve. So to do that, it's pretty capital intensive. And early on, when you're not registered and you don't have a legal establishment, it's hard to acquire capital, whether it's in the form of investments or even grants. Sometimes they require registration and proof of previous projects. So it's a bit tricky doing it early on. So what would you advise to actually perhaps bootstrap or raise that capital so that we can slowly start seeing that impact and that scale that we're looking for? So yeah.
Oh, such a great question. I'll give you a very Bay Area answer, which is you'll want it. So let's say you've done your customer discovery, you have a solution that seems to be working. Early in that journey, you'll want to register some kind of entity. And the reason why is because it's pretty cheap to do in the Bay Area, at least. And it starts to delineate your personal risk, whether it's your financial risk or other types of risk, liability risk, from that of your organization's activities. So there's some legal benefits of starting that organization early. And then, as you said, once you have that entity, then you can start getting some serious capital. And so I don't know, how do you resonate with that advice of go ahead and incorporate?
Yeah, no, honestly, it sounds exciting and it's something that we do want to do, but perhaps the question is more about where, because here where I'm based in Jordan, it's a bit hard. Ease of doing business is not as easy as we think it is. And even shutting it down, why most people don't register is because shutting it down would be harder even than registering it. So it's just about, okay, where would be an ideal place to actually do that and operate? Because our solution, we're hoping for it to be global as well. So it's just that dilemma of, okay, should we, and if we do, where and how, and yeah, these questions.
Yeah, and I imagine, at least for the US, there's all sorts of visa constraints that you would have to adhere to. And so I imagine that you'll just have to recognize the constraints that you have and find the best path, even though it might be a little painful and time consuming.
Yeah, thank you for that. Appreciate it.
So Fatima, if you'd like to voice over.
Thank you for giving me opportunity for the question. So my question is that if we are working on a solution that is basically connecting customers to the service providers or something like this, so we are working as a non-profit because at this stage it is comparatively easy to find volunteers and people that are mission aligned, but we want to convert it to hybrid or for profit venture in the future. So how can we prevent users and service providers to bypass us, because when we will convert it, they have to pay for our services. So this is my question.
It's a great question. I think first to recognize some people will bypass your system, and that's pretty natural. So we have a lot of these types of marketplace platforms in the US for different things, housing, equipment, all sorts of stuff. And what happens is they will use the marketplace to find a deal or a talent or whatever it is. And then the next time they might bypass the system a little bit. So I would just set the expectation that you will have some of that. So your job is then to make sure that your platform or your service is actually providing value to people so that they're willing to keep using it. And people will bake in that in different ways. So maybe you have a very particular way of presenting that nonprofit volunteer talent pool. Or maybe you have special information or special perks for using your marketplace. I think your task is to find that value proposition that will maintain the value of your organization so that people are willing to continue using it. Sure.
We have a question from Edward, who's having some microphone issues and requested us to read out. It is, how would you go about approaching scaling sustainable tech that targets a heavily government-regulated market?
Yeah. So scaling sustainable tech targets heavily government-regulated market. I'm going to say the obvious, which is for a lot of markets, including heavily regulated markets, but I would say all markets, having knowledge about working with government, having conversations with government and those regulators, and having that kind of part of your venture will help you scale and help you avert some risks to your venture. And so in a heavily regulated market, you'll have to be very well aware of those regulations. You may find that there are barriers to entry for entering those regulated markets that may influence the pathway you take to scale.
Thank you, guys. It's very short. It's related to the hybrid models. I know that it's very common for technical and engineering startup to act as and to use hybrid revenue streams to just stay alive and afloat in the market. But at what point could a founder know that it's time to, let's say, cut the cord and to fully commit, let's say, on the primary goal? Because, for example, some HVAC startups, they offer consulting, and aside from creating hardware, when is it time to stop with this? How can we know as young engineers and when we don't have any experience? And yeah.
There's a saying that the biggest risk to finding huge success is finding moderate success. And so I think in your investigation and your exploration as a venture, you should maintain an open mind as to what value proposition and what service or solution resonates most with your users. And so even if you start off with a consulting model, still experiment with other things and make sure that you have found the thing that resonates the most. And then what we often find with our ecopreneurs is that at some point, one branch of their organization is moderately successful, but that there's this huge other opportunity that they could be pursuing. And they sometimes have to make a very tough decision of, okay, we are going to stop our revenue on this channel so that we can focus on this other thing. And it's a difficult decision to make. You'll want to make sure your team is aligned on this decision. If you have investors, you want to make sure they're aligned with this as well. But we do see it all the time.
Thank you for your answer.
Yeah. Okay, great. And then Edward, I see your question. Since there are stricter regulations for government regulated markets, do you know what steps need to be taken to get innovations implemented? Yeah, it depends on the regulations, depends on your market. What I can just share a few things that we often see. So some of our early stage startups don't have the capacity to build a government relations team yet and other things, so they really leverage partnerships heavily. Partners that are already in that regulated market, for example, already have gone through some vetting processes with the government if they are a vendor to the government. We sometimes see in the US, there's some accelerator programs that have pre-existing relationships with government officials and policy. And so participating in those accelerators can give you that access and that influence. But it's tough to do that from the ground up. So typically you need some kind of partner in the beginning. Thanks for the questions, everybody.
Thank you for answering them.
Yeah, wonderful. So recognizing that we are just about a minute over, and for some people, it's very late wherever they are. Thank you, everyone, for your engagement, your participation, and the rich discussion. And thank you so much, Keegan, for doing this. This was incredible. We'll share the recording in a few days.
My pleasure. But wishing you all the best of luck. I'm rooting for you.